Hello, everybody. I'm here in Philadelphia, Pennsylvania, across the water. And it's been actually a few years since I wrote The Escape Artists. And I'm presently working on a book about Gandhi's Salt March in 1930. I'm almost at the point of finishing writing. So for some reason, I start to talk about nonviolence and in India and salt marches. Someone chime up and get me back on topic here. Tonight, I'm here to talk to you about escape artists. And I've written a number of different books on everything, as I was talking to Simon before, from Roger Bannister's Breaking the 4-Minute Mile to the Russian sailors on the battleship Potemkin who mutinied in 1905, to story recently about Rene Dreyfus in the 1930s Grand Prix. So sort of wide range of topics. But I always ask myself sort of two questions before I dive into a subject. And the first is, does this story have something important to say? And the second question is, do I have something new to tell, a new material that other historians and other writers have not talked about? And in the case of this story of the greatest prison break of the Great War, on the second question, it was rather easy. I was able to connect with a lot of the families of these POWs, mostly the children, the grandchildren. And they very generously gave me memoirs, letters, and various other material that really gave me a window into who these men were, what their struggles were, and how they managed to go about making this escape. So on the primary source level, I really just had a sort of rich reservoir of material that I could draw on. So that second question was easily answered for me. But the first question is, what's the story have important to say? And I'll be honest, this was the first book that I actually finished writing without being exactly sure what that was. I just, initially really wanted to write an escape story. I've been sort of fascinated by escape all my life. I think the Escape from Alcatraz was one of my favorite movies growing up. The Great Escape, of course, the World War II escape was fascinating to me. I read all kinds of escape literature growing up. So I just always loved this subject, loved this kind of material. And it wasn't really until shortly after I finished the first draft of the book, I was taking my family to San Francisco. And I asked my 11-year-old and 13-year-old girls, what do you want to see? What do you want to do? Do you want to go ride a cable car? Do you want to go across the Golden Gate Bridge? Chinatown, whatever you want to do. And my 11-year-old says, I want to go see The Rock. I want to go to Alcatraz. And so, next thing I know, my wife and I were on a ferry out there to this island in the Sound, and the weather was terrible. The wind was making the waves choppy, and it just was a horrible day. And managed to escape from that prison at that time, looking at it in the San Francisco Bay, just seemed all but impossible. And my daughter Julia said as much. We did a tour, and it was fascinating. And we get back on the ferry, and we're riding back. And my daughter says, they must really have wanted to be free, to have tried to escape that place. And I thought about that a great deal. And I'm not likening murderers and mobsters to these POWs in World War I. But I think there is something fundamental, this notion of wanting to exercise one's own will, of living a free life, of driving to do whatever it takes to obtain that. And that's really what is important about this story, and important about the individuals that are involved in it. I'd like to first introduce James Bennett, whose daughter Lori was really my first entry point into the story of the escape at Holzminden, which was in almost every way the kind of Alcatraz of Germany of World War I. Now, James Bennet in World War II, actually, every Friday morning he would sneak into his daughter's room before she was awake. He would go into her wardrobe that he had locked in there. He would take out his briefcase that he kept in there, as well as a number of items that he kept locked in the cabinet there. He would leave the house saying that he was going on a business trip to his wife. He would take a train into London. He would switch to a car and then head up to air stations across England. He was purportedly in the import-export business, but what he actually was an agent in the MI9, the escape and evasion service that Britain had launched just prior to World War II. And James's job was to go into these air stations and to lecture these pilots and other individuals on the art of escape. And if any of you find yourselves, for one reason or another, imprisoned or captured later this week or next weekend, the number one rule of escape is the bottom one here, is escape as soon as possible. And this note that you see, this image you see here, is actually the notes that James would carry to his speeches and put on the podium, and then give his talks to these airmen. And he would begin his story by talking of David Gray. Now, David Gray was born in India. His father was a bit of a drunk, a gambler, and David wanted to be everything really that his father wasn't. He joined military school when he returned to England. He then graduated from Sandhurst and then joined the British Indian Army. He served in the early parts of World War I out in India. And then in 1915, early 1916, he saw this airplane flying across the sky and decided that he wanted to be a part of that he wanted to be part of the Royal Flying Corps. Now, of course, World War I was really the launching point for air forces across the world, and there were a lot of people who weren't quite sure whether an air force was necessary. One British general said, and I quote, "It was a useless and expensive fad advocated by a few individuals whose ideas are unworthy of attention." The first Sea Lord, Sir Arthur Wilson, followed up by stating that when asked how many airplanes he would need over the course of the war, he said 2, which turned out to be quite wrong. Planes and the RFC turned out to be very good at reconnaissance and artillery observation, bombing German targets, as well as, of course, battling the enemy who had their own planes in the skies and defending the home front from Zeppelins and other bombing attacks. The question was, who's going to fly these machines, which were largely made out of wood, piano wire, and cloth. The engines were not terribly reliable. Crashes were very frequent. And in fact, about a quarter of RFC pilots died in just training. Just learning to fly. And who was going to be recruited for these people? Largely, they were initially Cambridge, Oxford, educated, wealthy, young men who, in some circumstances, even brought their own planes initially, and then learned to fly and the rest. The average lifespan for these pilots in the sort of heated moments of World War I was 17 hours in the air. Not a great deal. Their training was limited. They were sometimes the qualification to be allowed into the RFC, you know, they would ask, can you ride? Can you ride horses? The other question was, you know, at times, do you prefer Tennyson or Shelley as a poet? I'm not sure how relevant that was, but again, this was the nascent period of the RFC, and they were just learning how to operate it. Now, David Gray underwent that training, and in September of 1916, he was in mainland Europe. He was on a mission to go across enemy lines and to reconnoiter, and he was shot down by none other than Oswald Boelke, who was the leader of the German flying circus. He was the best German pilot in the German Air Force. David Gray's second in command was shot down by Richthofen, none other than the Red Baron, who was on his first mission. So it was kind of an auspicious event for David and his squadron. And he was shot down and found himself captured by the Germans. Now, two other individuals that just introduced briefly here are Cecil Blaine. Cecil kind of looks like a Hollywood movie star here. He was a troublemaker of the First Order. He was very daring, arrived at the airport for his training on a motorcycle and enlisted straight away. He was shot down soon after arriving in mainland Europe. The other individual on the right is Caspar Kennard. Caspar was living in Argentina when war broke out. He wanted to fight for England, came back, and he was actually shot down on his very first flight. Now, so what happens here is you have David, Cecil, Caspar, and hundreds of others, pilots, captured by the Germans, and really, you know, the fact is that the modern industrialized war in World War I, nobody was really prepared for just the sheer numbers of POWs that would come out of this. Germany in 1916 alone had about 1.65 million POWs under their command, just seas of young people that they had to take care of. Now, the evolution of prisoners of war, of course, had taken a decidedly good turn since, you know, the long history of the way that people treated prisoners was pretty bad. Aristotle said that those vanquished in war held to belong to the victor. There was a Byzantine emperor, sort of the most gruesome story I came across in POW was 14,000 prisoners were taken by this Byzantine emperor in a battle. He had every single one of them, their eyes taken out, except for one out of every 100 who only took a single eye, and had them marched back to their towns. That, of course, evolved, as I said, whereby, you know, early in the 1900s, there was a sort of codified language about civilizing war, civilizing the treatment of POWs that helped them both in America as well as in Europe. And there were some that said that, you know, that to be a prisoner in 1916, 1970, this is a direct quote, was a halcyon time to be nursed fondly in memory, a kind of inexpensive rest cure after the wearisome turmoil of fighting. But the fact was, with 1.65 million people under command, as POW, largely how you were treated was determined by whose camp you were in. And the individual who oversaw many of the camps in Germany was this general pictured here, General von Hainisch, who, you know, had command, fighting command at the early part of the war, did dismally bad. His son died on the line, and he just vehemently hated the Allies, and particularly hated pilots. And so for individuals like David and Cecil and Caspar, they found themselves under the thumb of von Hainisch and the harsh regime that he imposed on them. So now you have David and others captured, and almost very quickly, the first thing that they want to do is escape. And David in particular was just escape crazy. He tried to escape 3 previous times before he arrived at Holzminden. One of the first times he dressed himself up as a German officer. He spoke German fluently. David actually spoke 6 languages fluently. His nickname was Munshi, which was Hindu for the teacher of languages. He basically just in that uniform walked straight up to the gates, said hello to the guards, and walked right out. He made it all the way to the Belgian border, walked into a police station believing he had already crossed into Belgium, when in fact he was in a town named exactly the same name as the town, a German town named, and the Belgian town with the same name. He happened to be in the German side, found himself arrested, sent back to the camp, sent to a swamp where he was held in isolation for 2 months, starved, dehydrated, and nearly went mad. There were many types of escapes. If you ever want to read just daring do and wonderful, hilarious stories of escape, World War I is really the best place to look. One of my favorite stories are 2 young officers who buried themselves in the yard, dug themselves a trench, buried themselves in it, had reeds to breathe out of, waited until dark, dug themselves out and leapt themselves over the gate and escaped. Some Russians at one point, another great story, some Russians built a balloon out of paper mache, and their idea was to fly themselves over the gates and out to freedom. That went very badly. The balloon caught on fire and almost incinerated the whole barracks where they were being held. These men wanted to escape very badly. And one of the people that I profile in Escape Artists is Will Harvey, who was one of the great World War I poets. He was in 1916. He was a scout. He ventured across the lines, found himself in the German trenches. His plan was to map them out in advance of the attack that would come the following day. He was captured, and probably of anyone in the war, he spoke most eloquently and wrote most eloquently of what it was like to be a prisoner. And to be separated from one's squadrons or one's regiment. And I'll read you a couple things that he wrote, because I think it gives a sense of why there was such a drive by these individuals to get out of these camps, to escape and get back to the war. Here's Harvey writing about the circumstances of a prisoner of war. He cannot help them. He cannot join anymore in the dreadful and glorious fight for England and her liberty. Yes, he is futile. There is no more terrible reflection for a man. Her enemies are still unbroken. He is idle. That is the essence of his trouble, the true agony of the prisoner state. Harvey also wrote a number of very good poems, and I can't see you all here in the Facebook and live web stream, but I'll give you a little poetry because I love poetry. Here's Will again on the true agony of the prisoner state. Laugh, oh laugh loud, all yet who long ago adventure sought in gallant company. Safe in stagnation, laugh, laugh heartily, while on this filthiest backwater of time's flow, drift we and rot till something set us free. Laugh like old men, senses atrophied, heeding no present to the future dead, nodding quite foolish by the warm fireside, and seeing no flame but only I, the red, and flickering embers, pictures of the past, life like a cinder, fading black at last. So in 1917, Will Harvey and a number of other 500 officers, in fact, who tended to be the worst of the lot. And by worst of the lot, I mean those who kept trying to escape again and again. The Germans decided that they couldn't allow this to continue. And so they decided, as I mentioned very early, to build the kind of Alcatraz of Germany, a place that would be impossible to escape from. And so by the fall of 1917, all these prisoners who had escaped from other places and been recaptured are brought into this camp at Holzminden, which was formerly a cavalry barracks, and then really made kind of a prison inside of a prison inside of a prison. High walls, barbed wire, there were guards around the clock, there were German shepherds, rotating schedules, almost everything that you could think of to make a place inescapable. And this is just a brief picture. There were basically two main barrack blocks, Block A and Block B. Primarily in Block B, you had the orderlies and other individuals. In Block A was largely the officers themselves. The white area is a sort of general common area where they could walk in the yard. And then all this area in dark is sort of no man's land, where if you were found in it, you would be shot. Now the camp was overseen by a tyrant of the First Order, Karl Niemeyer. Now, Karl was born in Germany, but his nickname was Milwaukee Bill because he spent 17 years living in the United States in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, doing everything from being a bartender to a bouncer to various other sort of low ruffian jobs. Karl was an inveterate liar. He made up stories about how he was a spy in America, how he was awarded the Iron Cross, which was not true, how his ship was bombed crossing back to Germany, and he helped save a number of soldiers. He was just, well, I'll give it to the soldiers and pilots themselves. These are the various things they called Karl Niemeyer at the time. He was a cad, a low-bred ruffian, the personification of hate, a bloated, pompous, crawling individual. That one's not very nice. A man of unbridled ferocity and bravado, a cheat, a plausible rogue, a coward with all the attributes of one. He deceives, he is cruel, he blusters, he is dishonest, he cringes. Karl was a stern disciplinarian. He was known for ordering his guards to rush prisoners with bayonets if they congregated in too many numbers. He was the commandant of a previous camp and then got elevated to run Holzminden. And when you arrived at Holzminden, he would stab you in the chest or punch you in the chest with his finger and sort of declare that you will never escape. And just as a sort of humorous aside here, he was hated so much, Comrades in Captivity, which this cartoon you see on the right, was actually from Will Harvey's book. Niemeyer was hated so much that the joke was that even his dog could not stand him. But that is who ruled Holzminden at the time. And when David Gray and Cecil Blaine and Caspar Kennard arrive at Holzminden, they, like every other place they get to, they want to try to get out as soon as possible. The issue is, particularly David Gray has now learned the fact that it's just not enough to escape. You need to escape a camp. You need to make your way to freedom. You need to get across the border. And the best way to do that is to escape and have nobody notice. The prisoners who arrived at Holzminden tried a number of different things when they got there to escape. At one point, a number of men tried to sort of leapfrog the successive three fences by timing the rotations of the guards. They were caught. Another group tried to break through the walls into the officers or the guards' quarters and then out through the main gate. They were caught. Another group tried to create a ramp that they extended 16 feet out of the windows of the barracks. They constructed a rail on top of that and a car, almost like a train track. And the idea was to take that and sort of leap over the fences. That, of course, did not work either, and they were caught. So over the period of the first couple months, Gray in particular, who was Captain Gray, who was one of the senior officers of the camp, is walking around the camp trying to figure out the best way to get out. And he ultimately decides that really the only path out is to tunnel underneath the fences and the guards. But the question is, where do you do that? You can't start a tunnel in the middle of the yard. You need a place, you need an origination point to begin this tunnel. And so he surveys around and eventually finds this corridor in the orderlies section of barracks of Barrack B down in the basement. And there was this plank partition wall. This would be coming down from the ground level and then down towards the basement cellars where they kept food storage. There was also cells, jail cells down there. But there was this plank partition that Gray thought that if they could create a door out of two of these panels, they would have an area underneath the stairwell where they could start their tunnel. Now, what the Germans did by assembling these 500 officers and other individuals who had escaped all these camps is they had created, in essence, a kind of escape university, I mean, for lack of a better way of saying it. There were people who knew how to forge fake keys. There were carpenters. There were people who knew how to sew a German officer uniform perfectly. There were forgers. Really, any skill that you needed to escape, there was someone at the camp who knew how to do it, who was an expert in doing it. There was a number of individuals who had tried to escape by tunneling out of other camps. They were called, their nickname was the Pink Toes. The Pink Toes because their feet were often red and waterlogged from all the tunneling they did under camps. And so what David had in all these individuals was this collection of experts on how to escape, a collection of experts in tunneling. And first and foremost, to get started, they needed a carpenter to create this door out of these two panels because the guards would be up and down this corridor 100 times a day. So they needed this access point where they could press it, those planks, the door would open and close right behind them, and no one would know that they had come. They did so, and that was the beginning of the Holzminden tunnel. Now, initially, so they started this tunnel in late November 1917. And the initial thought is they would only actually have to go about 15 yards. Here's block B. A is the point where the tunnel began. Their idea was they could get to B underneath the ground, that they could get out and be free. So they're tunneling their way here about 15, 20 yards. By Christmas time, they're there. And David and others are thinking, you know, we're going to get out of here. We're going to be on the run very quickly. Right about the same moment where they almost emerged to the surface, Niemeyer decides to post a guard almost right on top of where they planned on emerging. And not only there, but all around the perimeter of the exterior of the camp, he was posting sentries. It's still unclear whether or not he heard a rumor about a tunnel. That is very likely the case, but there's no evidence to that one way or the other. But what's important is that 15-yard tunnel is no longer going to do it. In fact, they have to now tunnel 70 yards under the ground towards these rye fields that you see here at D, where they thought that they could emerge at night under the cover of the rye in the summer and escape unnoticed by the guards. A lot of the individuals who participated in this tunnel wanted to give up at this point. The 15 yards that they'd gone was hard enough. The idea of going 5 times that distance was seemingly impossible. And this was sort of one of the critical moments in the story where David Gray sort of takes charge and says, you know, this is the only way out. We have to do this. We're going to go as far as we need to go. And he rallies these individuals to continue with the tunnel. Now, I have this sort of this almost cartoonish image of what it was like to build this tunnel underneath the ground here. This is actually an image that was published with the children's version of Escape Artists. It does not do a very good job of describing what it was like to dig a tunnel under the ground for 70 yards. It was an absolutely horrifying business. Caspar Kennard, who was a claustrophobe, would write to his mother later of the absolute horror of being down there, the panic attacks that he would have. They would basically crawl. 3 men would go in at a time to tunnel. There would be one who would be down in the tunnel. They could probably dig about 1 foot a day, often with spoons, sometimes with the ends of their beds, but made very little progress. They had to have a sack attached to their leg as they crawled in. They would you could never really raise yourself above your elbows. Dirt was sort of constantly falling on you. It was very dark. You only had candle light. There were rats down there crawling over you often. There were cave-ins frequently, and there was very little air. The fact is that, you know, the further they went, the more foul the air became. They ended up constructing bellows to pump fresh air in there, but it was almost never enough. And so they would come out of this tunnel at the end of a 3-hour shift and just be absolutely filthy, sweating, miserable, and wanting never to go back in it. But day after day, they went back in. I'll just thread back a little here to this previous slide. This cartoon you see on the right here, they needed a way to support the tunnel as they went, so to prevent from cave-ins. And the only source of wood in the camp was the supports for their beds. And so they commandeered these from basically every bunk at Holzminden. And the joke was that if you ever sort of jumped into bed or leaned too heavily or turned over too heavily, that you would fall through your bed. They used those posts to keep the tunnel supported. There were quite a few hiccups, of course, over the course of the tunneling. At one point, they had to go through these steel bars that had been sort of put in the ground near the entry point. They had to get acid, actually. They found a way to get acid to manage to get acid from a local individual to use that to burn through the steel rods. At other points, they ran into boulders underground that they could not dig their way through, so they had to dig their way around. At one point, their entry into Barrack B became impossible, so they had to find another way down to the basement. They ended up going through the roof and down an interior stairwell. So there were all kinds of hiccups and challenges over the course of the months that it took to finally make their way towards those rye fields that I talked about earlier. Now, as I said, it wasn't just enough to get out of camp. They needed to make it to freedom, 150, 200 miles to the border through occupied Germany. There would be manhunts for them. They would need all kinds of supplies. They would need maps. They would need forged identities. They would need compasses. They would need food, backpacks. They would need to be able to have waterproof packs so that they could cross rivers. And all of this was sort of collected over months and secreted in their barracks, which were routinely inspected. But finally, by the summer of July 23rd, near midnight into the 24th, they're ready. They believed that they could get about 70 men through the tunnel. They started out, they drew sort of a lottery of who would go first, and they began crawling through the tunnel with their packs and emerging out the other side. 29 officers managed to make their way out into the rye fields before the tunnel itself collapsed. From all the movement in it. 2 men had to be dragged out by their feet in order to get out. Now, I think one of the things that sort of drew me to this story was just pure ingeniousness of some of these individuals. Not only in the construction of this tunnel and the securing of supplies and the cleverness and the ingenuity, but in particular the sort of outrageous, outlandish plan that David Gray, Cecil, and Casper concocted in order to get their way to the Dutch border. David, as I said, who'd been captured twice, was never going to be caught again. And he came up with, and they together came up with this idea of a cover story. And this is actually David. David's in the middle here. Cecil is on the left and Casper's on the right. And I just want to point out how different they look from those original images that I showed you, how sunken their cheeks are, how thin they are. All three had lost about a quarter of their weight in their time at Holzminden. Niemeyer had at one point sort of instituted a starvation diet. They were ritually abused, thrown in isolation. It was a terrible, awful place to be. And so they were largely degraded as people by the time they were actually managed to get out. And so they come up with this plan, though, where David, who spoke German, as I mentioned, would be an orderly from an insane asylum. And Cecil would be his assistant. And this ID that you see here in this image is actually for Karl Holzminden, which was Cecil's alias, as an assistant orderly from an insane asylum right near the Dutch border. And their cover story was that they had been sent out to recapture an escaped insane asylum inmate who happened to be Casper Kennard. And Casper did not speak any German at all. Cecil did a bit, so Casper was never to speak at all. And the idea was that if they were confronted, they would have this cover story and get out. And so really the first town they get to, they're traveling through night. They reach this town. People are alerted to their presence because there's someone out looking for escaped prisoners. These guys come out. They approach. Casper Kennard goes crazy, seemingly crazy. starts writhing on the ground, foaming at the mouth. There's Cecil and David. Cecil passes what is just an aspirin into Casper's mouth to calm him. The villagers are absolutely horrified. And frankly, they just wanted them to get the hell out. And so this cover story works again and again if they find themselves confronted by villagers or a crossing point where they have these forged identity and they're trying to get this insane asylum inmate back to his camp. 15 days after they got out of Holzminden, David Gray, Cecil Blaine, and Casper Kennard made it across the Dutch border to freedom. Soon after, the night of the 23rd, 24th, in the morning, Karl Niemeyer is alerted to the fact that a farmer comes to the camp and says, someone's been trampling my field. The guards and Niemeyer go out, discover the end point of the tunnel, and there's a big uproar at the camp. Niemeyer orders his guards to go into the tunnel to try to find its origination point. I'm having trouble saying that this evening. And the guards refuse. Niemeyer tries to send his dogs in. The dogs refuse. So they end up, over the course of several days, digging up this 70-yard tunnel from the rye fields back towards the barracks. And only after the third day that they discover this point underneath the stairwell. And this is actually, this is the starting point, as you see here, my cursor, where the tunnel. And these bags are the dirt that they would collect over the course of their digging, haul out, and then stack underneath the stairwell. As I said, there was a major manhunt sent out. Of the 29 people, officers who made it out of Holzminden, only 10 made it to freedom. The others were recaptured and brought back to Holzminden. Now, one of my sort of second favorite story of getting to freedom comes with Lieutenant Colonel Charles Rathborne. He was the senior officer at Holzminden. He was one of the 29 to get out. He, like David Gray, spoke German fluently, and Rathborne had no interest in hiking over 15 days to get to the Dutch border, eluding the manhunt and anything else. He decides that he's going to take a train, and so at the camp, before he leaves, he has a German businessman's outfit sewn for him, hat, gathers money, ID, goes to the train station outside of Holzminden. 36 hours later, after crawling into the rye fields, he is free. He sends a telegram back to Holzminden, to Karl Niemeyer, and I was able to get that telegram. Here's what it said. It said, well, to the commandant, having a lovely time, stop. If I ever find you in London, stop. Will break your neck, stop. 10 make it to freedom, as I mentioned. They're sent back to Britain. These escapees, they're heralded as heroes by the King of England and by the military. It makes national and international news. It's an absolute embarrassment to Germany. Karl Niemeyer is removed from his post. And it's a huge propaganda win for the British at the time, of one of the darkest times of the war, of sort of the daring duo and cleverness of the British against the Germans. And it became this incredible story that then somehow got lost to history for a long time. I'll return this story to talk and then love to answer any questions that people have to where I began with James Bennet. James Bennet was a Royal Navy observer. He was shot down over the North Sea. He was actually captured by a submarine. He landed himself in Holzminden and was one of the 10 individuals who made his way to freedom. And just to sort of give you an impression of the importance of what Holzminden was and the impact of it, not only was it just a tremendous escape story and a fun narrative, but really these individuals who escaped in World War I became the founding point and the teachers of escape for World War II, for MI9, and it just had this enormous positive impact. In World War I, just to read some statistics here, 573 British and Commonwealth airmen and soldiers who found themselves captured and behind enemy lines managed to escape and make their way to freedom. Because of MI9 and also the American end of things, the lessons that Bennett gave and others, the escape lines that were put together, the supplies that were given to soldiers and pilots before they left, 33,000 of British Commonwealth and American soldiers and pilots who, again, were captured, managed to make their way to freedom in World War II. So just a tremendous difference and impact that MI9 had, and that the lessons from Holzminden and other escapes in World War II had. James Bennet was an absolute hero. He never told his family of what he did in World War II. He had to keep it secret. It was only until he passed at 83 years old that his daughter Lori found a trunk in his house, opened it up, and found not only the notes, that speech note that I presented in the first part of this slide, but everything from the receipts that he had traveling to these air stations, to the compass that he invented that could be secreted inside of a buttonhole that he invented, and others like him to help future soldiers and pilots escape. And so that's the story of the Great Escape of World War I. Obviously, I left out a lot of details, but that's the heart of the story, and I'd love to answer questions people have for me.
Thank you, Neil. What we do here, because you can't see your audience, we ask people just to use the button at the bottom of their screens to raise their hands. So if I could ask people just to raise their hands as a show of appreciation, please. I don't know if you can see on your screen, but the number of hands is going up. Now, we've already had some questions come in. One or two of the people don't have their own PC cameras, so I'm going to read their questions out. So Tony Stiles is the first one to ask a question. He talks about Colditz Castle, which I hope you're familiar with, over the other side of the pond. It's obviously familiar to us from the World War II escapes, but he says it was used as a POW camp in the Great War. Do you know if there are any escapes from Colditz Castle?
There were in World War I as well. I don't think it was as fortified at that time. And but again, I focus most of my attention and on the Holzminden story. So the details of the various escapes from these camps, unless there were one of the individuals that I focused on in the story of Holzminden, I did not go too heavily on the research on. That said, like I mentioned in the early part of this conversation, and you can read, in the bibliography of escape artists, just the amount of literature on escape written by individuals and soldiers at that time are tremendous. They're fun books. They're often short. I believe there's one even on the Colditz escape. So I would strongly recommend sort of coming through that bibliography and finding those stories.
Okay, thank you. Sorry, I'm sorry, that's a technical glitch again. David, I know you're on the webinar. For whatever reason, I cannot promote attendees. It must be something to do with the problem we had at the start of the webinar. I don't know if, would you be available to promote John and Bill and one or two others?
Oh, yeah, let me do that for you, Simon. So let's
okay. Just while you're doing that, there's a question from Steve Mason, who again has no camera, but he said, is there any, he's talking about the similarity between this escape and obviously World War II escapes. And he said, is there any evidence that David Gray's MI9 briefings were seen by, and I think it was David Gray's briefings, was it? But those MI9 briefings were seen by the actual Great Escapers prior to their escape and capture. I mean,
it's very clear. I mean, if you're well acquainted with the Great Escape of World War II, the number of similarities between what was done at Holzminden and what was done at that escape in World War II. I mean, it is pretty remarkable. In terms of someone from the Great Escape of World War II saying, you know, I listened to this report or listened to this lecture by James Bennett, and I used that to escape. No one sort of mentioned that overtly, but I think it's very hard to believe that these lectures on escape, and in World War I, there was nothing like this, right? They never talked about it. In fact, you know, one of the more gruesome things that I learned of World War I pilots was they didn't even provide them parachutes at a certain point in time because they thought it would make them less aggressive in the air. And so them getting out and escaping was not something that they were terribly concerned about. But the amount of similarities on all kinds of different kinds of escapes in World War II, it's very clear that it had that impact. And if you just look at the statistical numbers, it's pretty evident.
Thank you. Okay, we've got people appearing now. John, do you want to unmute yourself and ask your question?
Sure. Thanks, Neil. That was terrific. While you were speaking, I went on, found an old map showing where the site was and honed in on Google, and it looks like it's a hospital complex now. Do you know if there's anything there that tells the story or any buildings that are remnants of the camp?
Yeah, I mean, there is. And you can, it's, you know, it's not easy to gain access to it. You just can't walk in, but I believe you can still get on to tours there where they have, you know, where that stairwell was, for instance, still exists. And there's I believe still a hole in the wall that they've maintained to show where the Holzminden escapees started their origination of their tunnel. The whole site has been built up, so you can't really get the idea of the rye field and where they were. But the buildings and those barracks are still extant. There's a local guide that you can take and see it.
Yeah, an easy trip from the UK. The other question I had, I wondered it might be to the general audience, was there sort of a loose association of escapees after the war? Did they?
Yes. I mean, they had a society for them, in fact, where originally it was the Holzminden crew, but then as time passed, they sort of involved any other escapees from World War I, and they held annual dinners for 50 some years until the sort of last ones passed. And you can, I have the programs from those events and memorabilia that was passed along and recollections that people gave. So, yes.
Great, thank you.
Thank you, John. Thank you. Gordon, welcome.
Are we on? Oh, good.
Yeah, we can hear you.
Good evening, Simon. Excellent presentation. Neil enjoyed it enormously. Like old boys, old stuff. Excuse me. Were there any instances of the escapees ever returning back to military service after they'd subsequently got back to home, and then had they go back?
I'll speak only really to the 10 who got back, but I think to an individual they all returned to service.
Right.
I think one of the reasons, it's very clear that David Gray, for instance, could not wait to get back to his squadron. And so, he ended up dying soon after. Cecil Blaine died in an air accident right after the war. But yes, they all went back into service. My recollection is that they took about 6 months off. They did a little bit of a publicity tour, some of them, and then they went back to it.
They were not captured again then, obviously.
No.
Oh well, that's one thing. That's good.
Yes, okay. that would be terrible.
Yes, because they'd probably shoot them then.
Yes.
Okay, Neil. Thank you very much for that.
Thank you very much.
Thanks, Gordon. Linda.
Hello. I was really fascinated by this. It's not something I ever heard about before or ever knew anything about. And I wondered I know you concentrated on some of, specific stories, but if you had information about the nationalities that escaped, what types of soldiers they were, the numbers involved.
Yeah, so as I think I mentioned at the very end of it, the number that they have escaping is 573 of British Commonwealth soldiers who made it back. That is largely, those are largely British soldiers. By the time the Americans were coming in there, it was a little late to the game. Some escaped, but mostly it was these British, Australian, South and British and Commonwealth soldiers and pilots who made it back. That said, the Germans who were captured, there were a number of them who managed to get out of England, which is pretty remarkable. And there are their own sort of stories from that end of things, of these incredible escapes from camps in Britain and managing to make their way back to Germany. So, again, there were Frenchmen who managed as well. And, these camps, a lot of them, not really Holzminden, but they were international camps. And so there were Russians galore and people speaking a number of different languages and nationalities, and all sort of helping each other try to make their way out.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you.
Thanks, Linda. Just before Mark comes in, just to say, David Bird, it's not a question, but he says, it's not a question, but just to say his father arrived in Holzminden on the 27th of July. And in his notebook, he wrote, the camp was in a bad state because 29 officers had escaped. So
that's fascinating. Yes, I mean, after the escape, things got very, very bad there. You also have at that point in time, really in the fall, where you have the plague sort of beginning to hit these camps, and a number of other issues.
Okay, we've tried to bring in. Sorry, Mark, just bear with. We've tried to bring in Bill Twist, but by chance, we can't bring him in, but by chance his question is almost identical to Mark's question. but very specifically about Karl Niemeyer. So if you'd like to comment on Karl Niemeyer in responding to Mark. Mark, do you want to ask your question?
Yeah, hi Neil, can you hear me?
Yes.
I was fabulous, and somehow I never considered like escape parties from the World War One. World War Two, I actually went to Salad 3, and I had an airman who was actually imprisoned there, and how the actual airmen were, how they entertained themselves. That was fascinating. But I guess my question to you is, did the Germans learn any lessons on how to handle POWs? Obviously in the second one there was these executions after Salad 3, but was there anything like real lessons learned, the way they held people? I know at Salad 3 that it was just Luftwaffe looked after our airmen, and there was no cross-pollination with the army. Funny old thing. I'm Air Force as well, so I wouldn't want to be mixing with the army, but that's personal. But yeah, my question to you is, did they learn any lessons, I suppose? That's the one I'm asking.
It's a good question. I mean, I also see this Q&A question in the list here about interviewing Niemeyer and sort of getting sort of lessons from him as well. Just to comment briefly on Niemeyer. Niemeyer sort of knew he was in big trouble. He was named in the British press as someone who abused these prisoners. And so when the game was kind of up, he escaped, and he actually had a brother too, who was a commandant in a different camp. And no one really saw the Niemeyer brothers again. They sort of disappeared. And they had embezzled, it was very clear that they had embezzled a great deal of money from the prisoners and sort of scooted their way out with that. So they never managed to pay for their crimes, unfortunately. In terms of what the Germans learned from World War I to World War II, that's harder to answer. I think the level of cruelty, obviously, in World War II was heightened to a great deal. I feel like in World War I, there was still a sense of this civility of war for these prisoners. They were allowed a great deal of entertainments. They were allowed packages to be shipped to them in these camps. I think if the Germans learned anything, not to do that, because all kinds of contraband came into the camps from wives and friends and from Britain to these camps, and hidden inside them and were tools for escape. So there was this level of civility that I think in World War I, by the time you get to World War II, is absolutely lost. That said, the structure of these camps and where they were located, you do see a lot of similarity in where camps were in World War II and where camps were in World War I.
Interesting. It's funny, that Niemeyer name. When I went through military training, we had like a discip who was a sergeant, a real bully, and he was nicknamed Neymar, and I never knew where the name come from. But you've actually answered my question. I never knew that. I went through 36 years of military life not knowing who Neymar was. So I've learned something tonight. Thank you very much indeed.
Thanks, Mark. Well, Neil, we've had a question come in on social media from James Sidney. He says, what do you think the reason was for there being so many home runs from this particular escape compared to other escapes both in World War I and II?
It's a great question. I think the most important thing that these Holzminden people did, and the reason I think they were so successful, was because of this idea that David Gray had, that you not only needed to get out, but you needed a plan to get to freedom. And the level of preparation that went into that, so that by the time these guys, got out in that rye field, they had supplies for a 15-day hike. They had maps on how to get there. They had forged identities. And they also had a head start. When just break out of the prison or rush the gates or various other things. I mean, they had probably, I think their head start was at least 12 to 16 hours. And so they were able to get, a reasonable way away before the manhunt began. But I think more important than that is just the level of preparation that they had. And that's why they were so successful.
Thank you. Again, we're having trouble bringing Richard up, but he asks, do you know of any German POW escapes from Allied camps in World War One?
German POW? Yes. I mean, there were several books written by Germans, actually, of noting their escapes from British camps. And so it definitely happened. And there was this propaganda war, of course, between Britain and Germany, between how they treated prisoners, the Germans claiming that the British were awful and terrible, and likewise the British to the Germans. And so it was not only about escape, but it was about, telling the story of how they were being treated.
Okay, thank you. Just for people watching, there are a couple of comments in there, they're not questions. Somebody's recommending a book on World War One escaping called Escape Us All by J.R. Ackersley, and also The Escaping Club by A.J. Evans. And David Wright talks about a 1938 British war drama film called Who Goes Next, inspired by the real-life escape that Neal's talked about tonight.
Yes, definitely worth, if you can find it, worth uncovering. And I will say that both The Escaping Club and Escapers All, they're fun books. Just in the level, I of course, I want you to read Escape Artists, but just the level of detail that they're able to go into on, some of the crafts that they and the plans that they concocted and the hilarity of it is just tremendous.
Yeah. Okay, I think we've come to the end of the questions. Sorry about the technical glitches at start and end, and thanks to David for being able to promote some of the questions. Oh, there's one more coming from Bill. Again, we've tried to bring Bill in as on video. I don't know if you can see his question. It's just come in. Holzminden aimed to spring 70-odd POWs. The Great Escape aimed for 200. The latter had a massive support organisation ranging from sand dispersers to ventilation mechanics, etc. Do you know what the background support was at Holzminden?
Yeah, I would say it was equally robust. They had a ventilation system in the tunnel itself that they had concocted. They had foragers. They had maps created for them. They had uniforms created. There were actually many more than 70 who were involved in one way or the other, from the orderlies who provided a lot of materials to providing cover and being lookouts. And so they just thought that 70 would be the maximum number they could get out before the next roll call in the morning. But there were many more than 70 who were involved.
Okay, thanks. Trevor Hancock sent in a very, very detailed one. I won't read it all out now. What I'll do, Neal, is I can print off the Q&As tomorrow, and I'll pick out one or two of the ones that are just information for you and email them to you, just so you've got that information through, rather than read up very long texts that's come in. So I think we've come to the end of the questions. I want to thank Neal again for a fascinating talk. If you've enjoyed his talk, I mean, his book is superb. Tonight was just skating over the surface of some of these characters and their stories and their failed escapes. So well worth reading. Highly recommend it. So if you'd like to just raise your hands again by way of a silent thank you to Neal. Thanks once again, Neal. Just before we go, just to remind everyone that on Thursday, we've got the WFA Big Quiz. So all the details of that are on our website. And next Monday's webinar is Spencer Jones back, talking about Charles Fitzclarence VC, also known as the Demon, looking at his military career and in particular his role at the First Battle of Ypres in 1914. So I hope you can join us for that. Registration details on the website. So Neil, fantastic talk.
Thank you, Simon. Thank you, everybody, for listening.
Thank you. This will go on our, well, it'll be on Facebook immediately after this, but it'll be on our YouTube channel in about 4 or 5 weeks' time. I'll ping you an email when it goes on there.
Brilliant. Thank you. Thank you, everybody.
Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, parlez-vous. Mademoiselle from Armentières, she hasn't been kissed for 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, parlez-vous. Out on kicking Armentières, broke the spell of 40 years. Hickey, picky, parlez-vous. The officers get all